Thursday afternoon webinar series. Thank you for joining us. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I'd like to begin with our land acknowledgement. And Crow Canyon acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Diné, and Hickory Apache people on whose traditional homelands our campus sits. Our work is not possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future. They are the heart of our mission. We respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. Crow Canyon is grateful to all Indigenous people and supports the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. Thank you to all of our Indigenous partners for your support of our mission. We can't do it without you. For those of you joining us on Zoom, if you have questions during the talk, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A section at any time rather than in the chat. Sometimes we do get people chatting in the chat and your questions might get lost. If you're having difficulties with Zoom, we are live streaming on Facebook, and you can come back later for this and other presentations on our YouTube channel. If you have not subscribed to our YouTube channel, please check us out. We have been accumulating a lot of really incredible webinars there for the last 4 years. On our upcoming schedule, we have next week, we have the mid to late Holocene hydroclimate in the Southwest, evidence from lava tube ice with Dr. Bogdan Onak. I think my friend and colleague, Dr. Jonathan Dombrowski, is excited to be moderating that one for you next week. And the week after that, we have a presentation from one of our in-house scholars at Crow Canyon, Grant Coffey, who will be talking about some of his research reassessing archaeological landscapes in the Mesa Verde region with LiDAR. So there is bound to be some amazing graphics. Please do tune in for the next 2 weeks to our upcoming webinars. As always, a huge thank you to our Crow Canyon. The entire organization of Crow Canyon is almost entirely supported by donations. And this webinar, this free webinar series, is made possible from all of your donations as well. Thank you to everyone, as usual, same people who often donate every time they register for a webinar. Thank you to all of you. It's really important. We're so grateful to be entirely donor funded for this free webinar series. Just a update from our advancement team, and some of you know our amazing staff who are in charge of planned giving. August is National Make a Will Month, believe it or not. And when you make the decision to include Crow Canyon in your will, you help to ensure our long-term future. In fact, an enormous amount of our operations are supported by planned giving. We are so grateful to everyone who is already Legacy Society donor to Crow Canyon. If you have any interest in jumping on board with August and Make a Will Month, you can check out some of our information on the website, and you can always just give us a call or shoot us an email and we will get you to the right person. So thank you for your consideration. Without further ado, I am really honored to introduce our speaker today and very excited for his presentation. Dr. Michael Charles is an assistant professor in the Department of Biological and Environmental Engineering at Cornell University, also an affiliate faculty of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program and a faculty fellow of the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. He received his BS in Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering from Cornell University and his MS and PhD in the same field from Ohio State University. As a postdoctoral researcher, he worked at the Newark Earthworks Center at the Ohio State University at Newark, studying the history of land-grant universities and their relationships to Indigenous dispossession in North America. His expertise involves developing computational sustainability frameworks that include dynamic ecological models and telling data-driven stories that advocate for underrepresented communities. As a Diné scholar, he's dedicated to forming mutually respectful partnerships with Indigenous communities. His vision is to combine computational methods with community-centered relationships to translate his research into action. At Cornell, the Charles Research Group is particularly interested in the vital role that landscapes can play in addressing complex sustainability challenges and how ecosystem services provides well-being to the human population. Along with his research, he works with the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change to advocate for Indigenous rights, leadership, and self-determination within the UN climate negotiations. Although his interests and advocacy transcend many disciplines and labels, most of his work is focused on increasing Indigenous representation in academia, policy, and social movements in the pursuit of justice and collective liberation. Dr. Charles, we are so honored to have you here today and to learn more about your research.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna go ahead and start by sharing my screen. All right, just gonna check that everyone can see that.
Looks perfect.
Perfect. And can I do a quick time check on when we're trying to wrap up?
So we tried to end at the hour, so that would be 5 o'clock Mountain Time and 7 o'clock Eastern Time. And
Perfect.
if you can leave a few minutes for questions, that would be great.
Perfect. We will aim to do exactly that. So yeah, thank you everyone. I'm excited to be here and to get to talk a little bit about some of this ongoing research that we have, but also kind of just to give a bit of a story on the historical side of how these kind of two concepts and two topics between Indigenous food sovereignty and land grant institutions overlap. So yeah, I think I'm going to also first just go ahead and introduce myself in my traditional language as well, in case there are any other Dene or Navajo people in the webinar. So Yat she Michael Charles Yaneshe, Bilagana Nishle Shihi Bashish Chin, Bilagana Dashish Che, Nakai Dene additionally. But thank you again for having me here. And I just kind of wanted to give a little bit of an overview of what kind of what we're going to talk about, but then also kind of try to give a little bit of background of some of the other different types of work and projects that we do, especially coming from an environmental engineering department and lab. However, today we're going to talk mostly from this data perspective, really talking through this historical lens of the history of land grant institutions. So we're first just going to kind of give a background around Indigenous dispossession and forced migration, specific to the US and somewhat a little bit broader to North America. And I don't think it's a new understanding to anyone around kind of the relationship between settler colonial expansion, kind of that sweep from east to west, and how it directly led to a violent genocide of Indigenous peoples and communities, but also forced migrations and resettlements into modern day reservations. And one thing that I thought was interesting was from this new book that just came out in 2020 was around kind of documenting how those kind of where that sweep went from what was considered kind of that open Indian land into that kind of transition towards settlement from colonial settlers into the reservation system that still exists today. And there was over 1.5 billion acres seized between 1776 and 1887 by treaty and executive order. And we'll give a little bit of background into what that means in terms of the treaties, and an executive order being exactly that, much more violent. I think can connect that to the Indian Removal Act and things like that. Since the 1880s, that number's increased by over still 90 million acres. So even though you'll see this extreme reduction in Indian land, again, that has just continued to be taken from Indigenous peoples here in the US. And so I thought that was an important point to make, that it wasn't just done by the 1880s, it's an ongoing effort. And we're just like barely now starting to see some concentrated efforts to kind of reverse that trend. And what's we're going to talk a bit more about today is really around the new livelihoods and the new knowledge systems that survivors had to kind of impose on new lands, and what would be some of those impacts associated with the dispossession. So I wanted to show this animation, and I hope everyone's bandwidth, including myself, is going to keep up with this short video. But essentially, it's just showing where blue is kind of the Indian homelands that continue to shrink, and red is those reservations that pop up throughout the country. Again, this is within that context of 1776 to the mid 1880s. And so what the one thing that's worth pointing out at this point is kind of what was considered available land when it comes to public land from the perspective and eyes of the settler colonial government. And so what we'll see is a trend of this sweep of reduced Indian land becoming this open public land, We see that through countless things throughout history, whether it's the Oklahoma land rush, and all the way to kind of where we'll connect that with the history of these land grant institutions. Again, where these lands are going to be what's considered that public or open domain land, as a result of that forced dispossession and migration. So there was an interesting paper in 2021 that came out, that was around the impacts of dispossession. This was scaled to all of North America, and looking at kind of some of those lasting impacts due to forced migration. In this right figure, I kind of just gave I reposted their essentially their abstract figure or summary of the entire paper. There's a lot more details if anyone's interested, but it was a really interesting take on trying to figure out really what are these impacts on different like climate and environmental variables due to the migration. So they saw general trends where there was it seemed to be a trend of increase from increased heat, reduced precipitation, leading more towards drought-prone areas, decrease in mineral value potential, and this is one where, again, scaled to North America, so that's why you see the historic value being around 55 million square kilometers, which is, I think, closer to 13 billion acres, where we talked about the 1.5 billion within the US. And it has just this like a very good overview of some of the ways that we can use these data sets that exist to try to kind of tell the story of the impacts of dispossession. And within this paper, they do start to highlight a bit around one of those impacts being fragmentation of lands. So communities that now don't get to have collective land as a group live in a community. You'll see that a lot through the state of Oklahoma has a rich history of how those lands have been taken, sectioned off into individual housing, and then sold off by family and by generation, essentially trying to reduce the community that the indigenous peoples had. And that's again a same tactic and strategy from the colonization across North America. We see just kind of the lack of federal or state recognized lands. This is going to be a huge part in the lack of data analysis for particular communities. If they don't have that state or federally recognized land, that means as a national level, from whether it's the USDA or any other group kind of making these data sets or defining what is tribal lands, again, without that federal recognition, certain groups will be left out. We see huge reductions in land area. Again, it's almost 98, 99% is what that value was, in terms of just the amount of land lost. And then the new environmental conditions. And this is something where we'll talk a little bit in the webinar around how things like the change in temperature, change in precipitation can be assumed as a proxy for the change in growing conditions when it comes to food security, food production. So that's kind of one way to think about it at this point, is connecting those meteorological variables or environmental conditions between heat and precipitation as essentially proxies for assumed impacts in terms of food production. And as we talk a little bit more around cultural knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge systems, it's important to also realize that having those changed environmental conditions means that if you've been doing you've had a cultural practice or farming practice for thousands and thousands of years, and now within the last 200 years, you've been moved to an entirely new place and trying to force to either one, practice your cultural traditions to hang on to them, but they also now might be fighting against, whether it's the most effective way for the new place that you've been migrated to. And then also now we're going to see that continue to increase across the globe with climate change. So trying to think around the ability for indigenous communities to maintain cultural practices and maintain, and obviously there's been an adaptation that's had to happen, but also just kind of showing why some of those might be also, if there haven't been those adaptations, negative impacts in terms of food productivity. And then this paper also kind of did a look around climate change risks and hazards. They looked at vulnerability to wildfires and drought, and saw that there was a general trend that was increased wildfires to the lands that indigenous peoples were migrated to, and again, mineral value. And one thing that we won't talk a ton about, but I do want to make sure it's mentioned, is that these are just kind of the impacts from that physical displacement. Yet we're not going to even really begin to touch the surface around the impacts of colonization, cultural identity, um, and things like that. So I just wanted to make sure that that's also made clear, that we might see some things that might seem like, oh, there was some sort of benefit, but remember that we're looking at it in a very fine scope for today. And so the question is, what does this have to do with land grant institutions? And again, I'm over at Cornell University, so thought it would be a good time to use a photo of our campus that only looks like this for a couple of months, and then we'll get back to the gray and wintry winters that seem to kind of take over the fall and the springs as well. So the founding of land grant institutions is how we're going to connect these two together. So we're going to start by just giving a background of the Morrill Act of 1862. This is the foundational act. I believe it was signed by Lincoln, that distributed public domain lands to states to establish and endow land grant institutions with this kind of ambitious mission, but also this noble mission in a way to make higher education more accessible and focus on practical sciences like agriculture. That also extends into engineering, military science. That was kind of the main mission and the main fields that they were interested in, which is interesting because we're going to talk about the accessibility, whether that has been maintained for Indigenous students and populations, and how it's really impacted food systems, which, the main mission of this being to improve agriculture and engineering and things like that. Within the Morrill Act, that includes nearly 11 million acres that were redistributed to endow 52 land grant institutions. Again, this only includes the ones founded in 1862 or established and endowed by that act. And it's interesting to think about the land grants were offered proportionally to the size of a state's population, but essentially it was by the representatives in Congress. And so thinking about the House of Representatives being directly related to a state's population, that's how the amount of land was distributed based on states. And at this time, it excluded Indigenous people who were not considered citizens. And so it kind of gives this interesting story around the time of what's happening as we're trying to found these noble land grant institutions that are going to have these missions and responsibilities to research, teaching, and public service. Now, I also wanted to note that there are additional land grant institutions and other acts that have done that, and again, connects it actually to the Morrill Act of 1890, which established historically Black colleges and universities. And then there was an Equity and Educational Land Grant Status Act of 1994. And that's really what established most tribal colleges in the country. And so it's also kind of interesting that land grant institutions, like some of these that have the biggest endowments in the country, like a Cornell University, MIT also is a foundation, is founded as a land grant institution. But how there is this kind of connection as well to historically Black colleges and universities and tribal colleges that may or may not be that visible or noticeable at this state. And what happened is in 2020, kind of in the middle of COVID, this big investigation was published and launched, and it was around there was this title. The story was titled "Land Grab Universities: A High Country News Investigation," which is actually a local journal and publication through the Southwest. And that was by Robert Lee and Tristan Ahtone, were the main authors of the actual report, but a whole team worked on this data set. And I was actually connected to this because I knew someone who was working on this data set, and they asked me to review it before it went to publication. And it was really interesting to see what was, what they were thinking about. How were they going to try to connect these land grant institutions with Indigenous communities and historic Indigenous documentations, and then try to really put pressure on institutions and how are they going to use the story to try to encourage institutions to do better, to encourage Indigenous communities to advocate for themselves, and really think about that connection of what does it mean for these institutions to be founded not just on Indigenous land, but with Indigenous land. And so this was, again, a huge publication that started a lot of different conversations. And even at Ohio State, we had there was a grant that I think that started 2020, 2021. It's actually what funded my postdoc while we were there. That was essentially to look at further into this story and try to determine, what does this mean for 1862 land grants? How do we respond? What are university administration willing to do? What do tribal nations want? So we did a lot of outreach, both with my time at Ohio State and at the time here at Cornell. At Cornell University, we also have now, we launched the Indigenous Dispossession Project, which there's a website too to kind of see some more updates around kind of what this has looked like. That included making a master list of all of the impacted tribes due to Cornell land, both within their 1862 Morrill endowment, like the parcels of land that they had from that endowment, and also current occupation, both within the campus and all of the kind of extended facilities around the state or research satellite research or institutions as well. And so that turned into this big process of trying to really figure out, what do tribes want? And that's, again, something that's going to be a very ongoing conversation. I think it's kind of hard to figure out where there's momentum, whether or not administration are willing to meet. So as all of this is kind of evolving, my work kind of as a data scientist was really to kind of look into what are some ways that we can use numbers to tell this story, as well as the voices of these impacted nations. And so the main contribution that this land grab university investigation did was it was able to locate over 99% of the Morrill Act land, and it connected it with the indigenous inhabitants at the time of seizure. And so what I mean by that is they looked at the historic signing nations, whether there was a treaty, a cession, or a database where the land was ceded from Indian tribes or groups. And so what this started to do was start to give us a much better understanding of, where was all this parcel land actually coming from. So now we get to see spatially what's the connection. And they were also able to kind of track down quite a bit of the value. So how much did a university pay for it, or how much did they raise by selling that land parcel? And then how much did that sit within the endowment and continue to raise money for the university? Again, those land parcels and receipts of sale are still in the books for all of these institutions. And so kind of the summary of that report was around this land that was taken from, they were able to identify approximately 250 tribes, bands, and communities through seizure and treaties. Again, I use treaties in quotation because part of their investigation was looking at which treaties were ratified and which ones were unratified, or in other words, which ones weren't honored or broken. Again, 3/4 of those were never held up, and it benefited, again, 52 universities. So there's this question of who really paid for these universities. And I've already said it once, but I'll say it again because it was a great kind of quote from this report, but it really highlighted the fact that land grant universities were built not just on Indigenous land, but with Indigenous land. And so with this, they also have this really interesting tool. It's at landgrabu.org. I'm going to highlight this so that everyone can go visit in their free time. And what's really cool about this was they were able to turn this into a more interactive data set. So for instance, if we wanted to click on all land grants in the state of New York, the only one is Cornell University. And it has this tool where you can kind of click those things. It'll pull up a map. Again, that point in red is Cornell University, and all of those little dots that are those blue highlights is showing the parcels of land that were used to fund. And so again, as we saw that sweep from east to west, you see that story again playing out when it comes to where these universities got land, and then the land that they were able to sell or keep mineral rights to kind of continue to fund and endow these institutions. But it does show a very interesting spatial displacement even between the connection between the land that funded the universities and the state itself. And so within Cornell, one of the histories that they talked about and we're always so proud of, and why Cornell actually profited the most, wasn't only just because they were given the most land by acreage, but because Ezra Cornell was a savvy businessman, the founder of the institution. And you can actually see a ton of land over in Wisconsin. And he's handpicked out that land himself because he was very interested in the lumber and the timber industry. And that's where a lot of that return on investment really came from. We can also then connect that to displaced communities from the Menominee, from historically the Chippewa, but relates to nearly 50 different present day tribes. And so being able to kind of connect that tells a very different story rather than one that's a savvy businessman who was able to make all this money is now a savvy businessman who is profiting off of a forest that people were just moved away from. And so that's again kind of makes it feel not as positive in terms of this history that kind of sits within the university. So it gives this report and this tool kind of gave every university a chance to kind of look at some of these hard truths and try to figure out a more detailed account to their history, one that is a tale that was I would say forgotten or probably purposefully invisible, but gave especially school historians an opportunity to try to think about what's the truth in this foundation, and are there parts of these histories that we're not telling. Again, probably relevant to many other things outside of just this topic. But along with this mapping tool, you can also look up the endowments raised. You can look up the impact by tribes and communities based on basically they have just this interactive table. It has paragraphs in between different tools, and I would just highly recommend people to check it out if they haven't. So as we kind of were after this kind of came out and we were thinking about what does this mean, how do we continue to build on this study to bring in more data to advocate for the tribal communities, to advocate for Indigenous peoples and scholars within these institutions? What does this look like? And so I was left with this question around, can we build on that land grab U data set? Can we explore the impacts of the Morrill Act of 1862? And my specific interest was on current Indigenous food systems. And part of that is because of my background within sustainability and sustainable engineering. I had done work with food systems. I was familiar with many of those data sets, and it was kind of a pretty natural connection to kind of think about the availability of land tenure today, along with in the past, that relationship to food systems, but also kind of in these current social movements, thinking about kind of what were ways that other communities could kind of give back or think about ways to kind of rectify this. So when my time in Ohio, we actually worked mostly within agricultural communities, wrote a couple papers or I guess articles that targeted kind of what farmers could do. And so trying to kind of highlight where there's all these other connections as well was important. But a big part of being able to do this work was looking at and asking what existing data sets are out there that really can give us useful metrics to even think about how do we analyze Indigenous food systems. So after some exploration, again, I worked with one of my undergraduate students as well, Peter Tai, who did a lot of this kind of work in the initial start, trying to think about what data sets were out there. Do we have it at a national level so that we can kind of look across all present day tribes and all different parcels? And so we kind of came up with three main categories to start with, and that's food production, food security, and meteorological conditions. And within food production, it was really difficult to try to figure out, how do we analyze these things when we're essentially trying to look at not necessarily super detailed. We don't want to look in very specific to an individual tribe. We wanted to do it at a national level so that we could really contribute to this land grab U data set. And so we opted with using kind of the USDA's low spatial resolution approach, which is through what's called the National Commodity Crop Productivity Index. And so that's basically looking at maps of soil across the country and looking at the soil quality and how it would relate to growing crops that are commodity crops, and specifically that was is corn, cotton, soybean, and switchgrass. And then they also have an average metric for that. And so we've decided to kind of pick those to start with for food production. From the food security side, we got that data from Feeding America, a big national nonprofit that does a lot of data into food security. And we were able to pull from their data sets food insecurity rates, childhood food insecurity rates, budget shortfall. So kind of the average gap between kind of the family's spending or budget and what they need to secure food for their family, and then cost per meal. Again, data resolution is also an interesting part within this, where the food production, the soil mapping that we have within this country is at a very high resolution in terms of spatial scale. Food security, we were looking more at the county scale. The meteorological conditions, then we pulled up maps for temperature and precipitation. Again, also we have at a pretty high resolution, actually not as high as the food production. But what we were looking at was similar to what we saw in that first study, was how could we use temperature and precipitation as a proxy for the effectiveness of indigenous knowledge within these kind of migrated scenarios. And so that's kind of the proxy that we're trying to use to kind of make that point. And so we were looking at temperature and precipitation. We have it at a monthly level, and we took it across 9 years, pulling out data from 1980 to 2020 every 5 years. So all that to say, we were able to basically get a lot of data points, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so what became the core of this project essentially was trying to figure out, one, how do we do the spatial analysis from the GIS perspective, and two, can we tell a story or pull out something interesting from all of this data? And that's kind of the main hurdles we had. But we came up with a core objective, which is, again, to kind of replicate some of the work and contribute to what Lee and Ahtone did with the Land Grab U. And that objective was to create an online data visualization platform for determining the impacts on food system metrics by specific institution endowments and connect them with present-day tribal nations. And so there's two specific things that we're including that kind of gives novelty to our work. And the first is that inclusion of food system metrics. And the second is really connecting them to present-day tribal nations. As I mentioned, they were able to pull the historic signing nations from all of these sessions. We have data sets that kind of talk about ceded Indian lands, session documents around kind of which tribes were on that from a historical perspective. We have also some data sets, actually mostly through the US Forest Service, that have tried to connect at the session level, trying to connect what present day tribes would be associated with each session. Now, the problem was none of that was all in one place. So that was kind of part of the hurdle we had, was trying to pull out all of these data points, all of this, again, text, if you're interested in the software development point of it, and try to really match things, try to figure out, why is this tribe not being included in our data analysis? And we find out that in one of the 4 data sets, they didn't include the word "of" when they said, let's say the reservation of the Siletz people or something like that, and the other one just said Siletz tribe. And so it was trying to figure out all of these names that never had any sort of normalized language or terms that kind of made this a fun and interesting project. And so I'm not going to talk a ton about the actual methodology, because I think it'll be more interesting for us to have a conversation around what's available, where we see this going. But again, I think it's also very much a project still ongoing. I was actually telling Taylor that I was actively working on new results today, and my computer was running new software to see if we could get it done in time for the webinar. I got it all to work, but unfortunately didn't have time to actually turn it into newer and updated figures. But what I think is interesting is just kind of not necessarily the exact results of the data, but what we can get out of it, what we expect from the tool in the future, and kind of that's why I'm going to kind of glaze a little bit over the methodology. But just to get the big picture of what we're doing is essentially we're looking from a GIS perspective, or geographic information science and their systems and science. Is on the left, we have a map of here's all the present day tribal lands. So within data sets that we have of this, we have shape files, we have an understanding of kind of the geopositioning of where these exist, and what's the name of the present day tribes that are associated with those tribal lands. On the right, we have the Morrill Act parcels. Now, this is the data set that was directly developed from the land grab view. So the spatial location of each of these parcels. But again, within this, we also have what is called the MTRSA code, but it essentially is giving us a code around what session or seeded land it would be associated with. With that code, we can then kind of look up the historic name, connect it to the present day tribal name, and then try to kind of conduct these weighted averages that compare, what was the average state of food productivity in the land associated with the parcels today, and comparing it with tribal lands. And so from the GIS perspective, it's a lot of data clipping. So thank you to Peter, who did all of that, clipping all these existing data sets within spatial boundaries, again, for these two different sets of land. And all the data sets I mentioned in the previous slide. Then we were able to kind of use those historic session documents, similar to how Lee and Ahtone were able to use it to kind of report on those historic signing nations. We focused on making that connection between historic signing nations and present day tribes. So we actually came up with a library that has every historic signing name and connects it to present day tribes if they exist. There's a lot of tribes that would be associated with a non-federally recognized tribe, or a group of non-federally recognized tribes. And so our new data set also has all of that. And then kind of the fun for me, but also the challenge, and I hope fun for Peter, who was working on this as well, was developing some sort of software, lots and lots of data analysis scripts to kind of conduct the statistical analysis. Again, when I say millions of data points, thinking about within a given row, if at the it's completely based on the resolution of data. So for instance, the soil resolution for either data set in present or the parcel data, it's probably close to 900,000, 800,000 different data points collected with these values of soil productivity. And then we have to match all of these things across, 900,000 for one, and then do it again for the historic and the present day tribal lands. Thinking about some of those temperature and precipitation data sets, again, we kept the resolution at every single month. We also kept later had to process it. We kept all the statistical significance. So comparing across 9 years, those averages, those standard deviations. So again, a lot of it was just large data analysis. And so I wanted to give just a little bit of insight to kind of what data it is that we've collected, or are able to kind of evaluate at this point, a little bit around the story it tells and kind of what we're expecting. And so this is kind of the first plots that we've been thinking about doing. Again, we're just kind of mapping out the food security versus food production. And those come directly from the food security rate and the NCCPI. Again, we could also do it with child food security, change in budget shortfall. We have a lot of data, and it's almost we're at the point where it's what is worth showing. Otherwise, we would just be looking at hundreds of these graphs without really knowing what to learn from it. But what's interesting at this point is here's just plotted all of the present day tribes that we have. And one thing that I think is showing us, one, that we are onto the right track, but it still tells an interesting story, is if you think about some of the change in food security rate. For example, Oglala Lakota is associated with the Pine Ridge Reservation, and Pine Ridge is like pretty well known as one of the poorest counties in the United States. And so it makes sense that we would see that as one of the lowest in that change in food security rate. It's the same with the Rosebud Sioux, but if you look kind of and maybe we can see my mouse as a pointer, maybe not. But these kind of points in the lower quadrant where it's negative change in food security rate and a trend with that a negative impact on that change of food production potential. Almost, I think all four of these are from South Dakota, within the Lakota bands of Lakota people. What's also interesting is these stories of a lot of these smaller, what are called rancherias out in California. You see these out here where they have some of the highest and lowest change in food production potential. But what's really interesting about those areas is, one, they're surrounded by some of the highest, the biggest agricultural areas in our country. California being the main producer for a lot of our fruits, vegetables, a lot of crops. And so sometimes it's a story of data resolution. Some of these they're some of the smallest federally recognized Indian lands where I can't remember exactly which one, but one of these rancherias, if you look up their tribal land and zoom in on it, it's essentially just a building. Their federally recognized land is their tribal offices. And if you actually look into it, they have no grass area. So it's just kind of a parking lot with the building. I believe it is actually Bridgeport. I might be wrong. There might be another one down here. And so that's why you see such a low change in food production potential, almost to zero on their tribal lands. But in the same case, you get other small ranch areas where might be a data resolution thing where they're surrounded by some of the most productive soil from the USDA's perspective. And so some of those are going to show this, this huge change in foods and agricultural suitability. So there's a little bit more for us to really look into in terms of, what's the story behind all of these. There is some interesting. So if we think about where the zeros are, that left quadrant is, negative impacts on food security and food production, which means that in this top right quadrant, there's been positive impacts on the food production potential and the food security rates. Again, that's by spatial analysis, not necessarily telling the history of that colonization or the impacts across time. And so I think that's one thing that we have to be kind of really careful when we do this analysis, but it's also kind of an interesting story to think about what that migration has meant for different communities. Again, we can do the same thing with change in precipitation versus changes in temperature. What's really interesting is there are some communities that are in drastically different climates. And so in this one, it's not necessarily the quadrants being good or bad or positive or negative impacts. I like to think of it as a vector between that origin, that 0, 0, out to any point. And kind of the length of that line that you would have to draw is going to be the kind of the impact in terms of the change of the climate variables. But again, some very interesting ones where the Kickapoo tribe in Texas came from a very cold climate and now have almost over a 200% change in temperature in terms of average temperature across the year. We see some where you get 200% increase in precipitation. A lot of the Florida tribes, a lot of the Southeast tribes, Louisiana, Mississippi, some in Washington as well. Where they weren't coming from that humid or a climate with that much precipitation. We see also a lot of similar negative trends in terms of precipitation and temperature, thinking about places that would be moving more towards different desert areas. What's kind of interesting is trying to figure out what's the overall trend here. Is this really telling us a useful story, or is this going to overall in terms of the impact of the Morrill Act, or is this something that's going to be more interesting if you were from a specific tribe or the leadership from one, just to kind of see whether or not you care about that connection to the Morrill Act, but thinking about that impact of the forced migration and what it might mean for the food systems that you grow. And so also just wanted to highlight, this is just an example. Again, the end goal is to have a user interface that anyone can kind of play with all of this data, just automatically generating these figures. And this is using that example of the Kickapoo tribe, because they're in the top 5 for changes in temperature and precipitation. And again, the temperature shows a very, in terms of seasonal dynamic, shows a very similar trend. Pretty generic trend we're familiar with, where it's cold in the winter, gets warmer in the summer, with a pretty large gap, I would say, in the actual temperatures. And again, this is in degrees Celsius in terms of this gap in here. Within the precipitation, what's interesting here is actually as the months between May and September, where the historic lands, which are in red, and the present day tribal lands, which is in blue, once you kind of hit that growing season from May to September, where they came from would be the time of year when they get the most rain. But where they're actually now in the where they've settled into the federally recognized tribal lands in Texas, that's when they actually seem to hit some of their biggest droughts through that summer. And so that's what's kind of interesting, is how would that impact if you were, planting things within the same timelines, or thinking about what might those traditional practices have been, and how have those had to adapt if they were in one area with precipitation trends that look in the red line versus the trends in the blue line where they are now. So I just kind of wanted to give a little bit of an example of some of the data that we have. Again, it's all still very new in terms of the software development side. So kind of every day we've had a new update or a new version of these figures, or have gone and manually gone through and found some language mismatches. So some tribes were missing. So again, not to worry too much at this point around those results, but more about the potential of what this kind of data would provide. And so kind of wanted to give a few discussion points before talking about some of the expected impacts. And that first discussion point is really first around that food productivity metric, which is based on soil quality, landscape, and climatic conditions. It doesn't represent harvest outputs. It doesn't assume that there has been something planted into the ground at all, or that there is even availability for that food production. It also doesn't include soil contaminants. So those that lands that have been close to Superfund sites. That's kind of the story here in New York. A lot of the tribes that we work with here in the state of New York are directly impacted by those Superfunds or spills from toxic waste from different industries. Same with uranium, which is the story in the Southwest, especially for where I'm from in Navajo land. And so that's also something that's not considered at all. And it's actually a conversation we've had a lot actually up here, which is around food sovereignty means a whole different thing if you're not willing to even grow your own food due to the understanding of what contaminants are in that soil. So some of the other limitations of this metric besides that is it's limited to just those identified commodity crops. It also excludes fisheries, local products and initiatives, and traditional foods that might be outside of those commodity crops. And so thinking about a lot of indigenous communities that would be fishers, hunters, gatherers, it doesn't include any of that. So if it doesn't have food productivity, isn't related to the knowledge of the people to go find the wild crops that grow easily without kind of these farming practices. So it is a very narrow look at what food productivity means. It's also the only really national metric that the USDA uses for this type of food productivity. Another thing to note is that the data is for existing rates. So we can't go and find these data sets in 1865 or whenever, or 1862 when the Morrill Act was signed. And so what we're really looking at this point is the results of these changes, that what I call based on two parties. And the first is the indigenous peoples in their current tribal land. So the people on those reservations, on those federally recognized lands, and comparing it to those who have settled onto their ceded land. And so that's just kind of one thing to think about, is we're not giving a historical account of the impacts of food security in comparing, a tribe's ability to feed themselves in 1862 versus 2024. What we're looking at is the difference between people who have settled into those lands, and where and the state that they have within their federally recognized lands. And then finally, again, want to keep highlighting this just because I'd never want our work to be kind of taken out of context, which is this point that the research doesn't consider other impacts of colonization. Those impacts include, but aren't limited to, population, just the numbers of population we've seen drastically decrease through the genocide. The identity, thinking about the cultural identity and personal individual identity of people from indigenous communities, the impacts of colonization on cultural knowledge, language fluency, and land rights and sovereignty. And so this research, again, should never really conclude that a tribal community benefited from dispossession. Even like in that first figure where we saw, here's a community that had an increase in food security and food productivity. Again, that doesn't consider any of these other aspects. And so just want to give a little bit of potential impacts in future work, and then we'll open it up for questions. But in terms of the potential impacts, what I think is interesting about this project is, first, it gives an opportunity to develop and produce more data that gives leverage for tribal nations to advocate for themselves. I've done a lot of work with tribal nations in communities where they know, something is wrong or feels wrong, or feels unjust, but they don't have the right language to advocate for themselves within the language of either the law or within the kind of the language in terms of how we make business decisions. So can we turn it into a dollar value? Can we turn it into a legal stipulation? So this is one thing that I think does help give some numbers to help these tribal nations do some advocacy for themselves. It also encourages, I say that's kind of the nice way to say it, or pressures land grant institutions to recruit and support Indigenous students, staff, and faculty by highlighting their return on historical injustice rather than investment. And then highlights the limitations of existing food systems data at the national scale and incompatibility with Indigenous food systems. And so when I first actually did this case study, I was at Ohio State. I did it at a very individual for that university. And what was interesting is we kind of just realized how much this couldn't tell. Like, the data was interesting, but all it did was show a bunch of gaps of why it wasn't enough. And so that's kind of one thing we want to use when it's time to kind of publish this, is to really kind of make a call out to other researchers in the fields of agricultural and food system science, and thinking about, what is really missing from the way that we collect data that is incompatible to Indigenous food systems, but even thinking further of the way we should or want to transform food systems at a larger scale across the country or across the globe. So just trying to think about what's those gaps of how we collect data on food system quality, food system productivity, as we're trying to switch away from this industrial agricultural mindset. Then when it comes to future work, again, the end goal is really to launch that user-friendly online tool for anyone to use and explore the impacts for any university and any federally recognized tribe. That limitation is mostly because without the federal recognized tribe, we don't have present-day tribal lands to connect to and make that comparison. However, we will keep a data set of the non-federally recognized tribes by state. So it'll basically just say, like, non-federally recognized tribes from California might have this had this impact in terms of their cession data, but won't have anything to necessarily compare to for present day tribal lands. And then finally, kind of the last phase of this project is going to be to contact tribal leadership and tribal colleges, again, connecting to those 1994 land grant institutions from the tribal nations most impacted across all universities, and again, for individual institutions. And so the kind of the highlight of this is really just trying to get an exploratory tool for people to explore, what are the impacts of food systems. And again, I don't think we're going to give more answers, but we're going to give a lot more, hopefully, questions and discussion points, and hopefully in an interactive way for other people to engage with this type of data, this type of research. So just wanted to say thank you to everyone for being here. Or thank you, and Dene. And yeah, I'm open for questions, and my contact information's there as well if you need it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charles. That is fascinating and a lot to digest and take in. And we have we've had some questions come in, and I have a couple of questions, but I wanted to maybe to go back to that the first we've had a few questions and observations around the moving slide that you showed in the beginning that started with
Mhm.
the original indigenous lands, and it's so, I mean, it's such a powerful depiction, right? Obviously, to see it in that way, I think it has struck a lot of folks. We had a specific question around what the gray areas meant along the East Coast and in the West. Some folks wanted to know, weren't these were indigenous lands too, right?
Yeah, so again, I think the main point for this one is I think this map started in like 1780. Um, is when so this was all part of this study that's actually connected to that book that I kind of talked about from 2020. Um, and so yeah, so it talks about essentially you're looking at those 13 colonies that were the foundation prior to 1776. But it's also, I think, relating to other, so not just kind of English settling, or European settling, I would say, on the East Coast, that would be
Mhm.
the foundation of the United States. But there are some of these other gray areas, and I'm assuming that, up north is probably French coming down, maybe Mexico or Spanish, I guess Spanish kind of territories at that time. And so that's that gray land is, you're assuming that, the assumption is that we're starting in there. They've have already been removed.
Right, right. Wow, it's really powerful. And the remaining reservation lands, so such a obviously tiny fraction. I think that's an excellent metric to really get that point across to folks who should know it, and many do, but that visual is really amazing. To maybe touch a little bit on the concepts, right, that you're dealing with food productivity and food security. The discussion points super helpful in understanding in terms of, obviously there's limitations to those food productivity metrics, but it really seems to shout out that there's so many variables concerning food security and subsistence practices that are so many. There's more negative impacts from colonialism that you could possibly really quantify. Where do you even start, right? And it seems like you've made such a great start with the metrics that you've chosen, and that even those really indicate the the extreme challenges. Where do you think, in terms of maybe moving towards some positive change or social justice or restoration, where do you maybe see some of this research going that could be beneficial to Indigenous communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will also say we have lots of like other projects too that kind of highlight different areas of this. So one of my students is also working on kind of giving a systems concept map of how racism impacts food systems. But that's not just limited to indigenous peoples or lands. So we have a few other things that are touching around kind of better food systems and trying to highlight the role of from these kind of social aspects, I would say, in terms of race. We are looking at a lot in terms of direct applications of land use change, working with tribal nations. We do some work on quantifying like the ecosystem services to help tribes that are fighting new commercialization on their tribal lands, trying to help use kind of results like that in law court cases. So I think there are lots of ways in terms of this specific project. Really, what I see as if it being an effective tool would be to really use this for tribes to really understand better kind of their migration story, and try to also use it as a not necessarily a target, but a way to encourage land grant institutions. Again, their founding mission was around public service, teaching, and research, but essentially that public engagement and community engagement can be a noble mission as long as we're willing to accept this history and try to include Indigenous peoples in that. So I see it as from inside the with from internal from in academia, using it as a tool to kind of pressure and encourage our institutions to do better community engagement, to include tribal colleges, tribal nations in our extension programs that just about every land grant institution has. And then from the tribal community side, again, having a better understanding of some of the impacts of migration and kind of the state of how that how these things have left the current state of their tribal governments, tribal nations, and trying to figure out better ways to do that advocation with some data in their pocket.
Fantastic. Well said, and probably a good note to end on. We're a couple minutes over. I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much, Dr. Charles. We will continue to pester you, and you have an open invitation. If you are ever in down back in the Four Corners area, we would love to host you on campus.
Perfect. I really appreciate that. Thank you again to everyone for tuning in.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.